Hi, in this video I'm going to show you how to make some simple cloth toggle buttons. They're very easy and can be used for all sorts of different things. So let's get started. To create the pattern, I'm going to be using our square button template. You can of course use anything that you wish to create a square. And the first one that I'm going to show you is on a piece of fairly thick cotton. I'm going to mark out on the wrong side and basically choose a square. Now the thing about making a toggle button out of fabric is that you have to think about not only the button itself, the size of the button that you're making, but the fabric and how it will hold up to being used as a toggle. You may wish to add interfacing, for instance, with a very fine fabric. So I'm just going to cut out that square. Now the next thing to do is, if you imagine that there's a line running diagonally, okay, you need to fold in one corner, and I'll finger press that so that it's running along that line. Basically what you're going to do is create a kite shape. As you'll bring the other side in now as well, and finger press. And we're going to just bring up the point a little bit, finger press that, take a few of those threads away. And then this end will also be put in and finger pressed. And if it's something that's really keeps coming loose, you might want to give it a little stitch now. So let's just take the needle through there. I've knotted, I'm using a contrast thread because I want you to be able to see what I'm actually doing. But of course it will be much nicer if you use a matching thread. Okay, so that I'm going to leave that in place. So this end down a little bit. Now here you need to wrap this around a stick or a pin, and that again will depend on the thickness of your fabric and how strong the fabric is at maintaining its own shape. So because this is fairly small, I'm going to use a T-pin so that I get a very small, fine center. So it's not the easiest thing in the world to do. You can dampen the fabric a little bit if that makes it a little easier for you. And then fold in, and I'm just rolling it. And as I roll it, I'm getting a little bit of what you could say is a little bit like a croissant. I'm just going to make sure that that edge is tucked in. And before I let go entirely, give it a good roll round. Sometimes I find that if you roll it and unroll it a few times, your fabric will hold up to being rolled just that little bit better. You see that's unfolded just a little bit on that edge. Because this is a thicker fabric, it doesn't want to behave, so you have to make it behave. And of course, thin fabrics, if you want a different look altogether, you might like the raw edges. So you can leave them as well. So just tuck in those raw edges so that everything looks neat and tidy. Trim those long ones that don't want to behave. If in doubt, snip it out. And then I'm just going to stitch that down. And it'll take a while because this fabric is on the bias and it wants to unravel at this point. So just have a bit of patience. In a moment, I'm going to show you how to do one of these with a wool. And of course, the wool doesn't have the raw edges and it does really work nicely. But this is a great option for your sort of boho designs, and you can even use it as a sort of fabric bead. So I've just stitched that through. And I'm going to take that out. And basically that is your little toggle button. Try to get it so it comes into focus for you. Rid of that one long bit. Now what you can do now, because this is sort of showing up the way that it is, I'm just going to knot this off. And I'm going to put a little bit of binding around the center, just to cover that through. And my apologies if you can hear Toby barking. He doesn't like the next door neighbor going out for a walk. And that will be who he's barking at. So I'm going to show you how to do a binding knot here. So take a piece of thread and make a little loop. Hold the loop alongside what it is that you wish to bind. This is the same thing that you can use on little tassels. And we're going to wrap around, and we're going to wrap towards the loop. So we're covering the end, we've got this end sticking out, and we're working down towards the loop. You wrap fairly tightly and as evenly as we can until we're happy with the length that we've worked the toggle. I think that will be quite nice. Cut a little end. Thread that end through the loop. And then hold it. Pull the other one so that the loop catches, and then let go so that the loop can go underneath. You'll feel it sort of pop, and then you'll know that the loop is inside, taking the end inside. Now at this point, depending on how you're going to use and treat the toggle or the binding, will depend on how you actually work with this. But what I like to do is usually just thread the two ends and then thread them through so that they go back to the opposite sides. I'll often run them back and forth a couple of times as well. And I try to catch some of the threads underneath, because by catching them, you're actually helping to secure it. And then pull up and snip, pull up and snip. And that gives you a little toggle button. So again, I'm using the square template and some wool. That's quite a dark wool. I'm going to go a little bit bigger, and I'm going to use a gel pen to mark this wool out. This is a nice thick wool that doesn't really require any type of turning under. So let's see, let's go, actually let's just go only a little bit bigger. Now the gel pen isn't going to soak into this properly, but it will give me a good guide, and I prefer it to chalk in most cases because I can see it a little bit better. But what I would recommend is just to dab it so that you don't get it all over your fingers, which will then take it over to the other side of the fabric. So just a little hint there. So as before, cut out. And because this is a nice thick wool, there's no need really to turn down the top and bottom corners. All we need to do is fold in and fold in. Now, as you can see, that is strong. It doesn't want to move and fold into place. So you've got two options here. You can, if you really want to, get a hot steam iron and press this down if you're using a thick wool felt like this. However, you may find it easier to simply work some stitching. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to line it up as much as I can, and I'm just going to take stitches back and forth along this edge, just a whipped stitch, so that this just holds this in place. I think that this type of button really works well with a thick wool. It just has so much structure all on its own. So now you've got a little cone shape. And again, there's no really need to knot this. You can just stitch it through a couple of times because this is all going to be on the inside. But I am going to knot the end of my thread so that it's ready to use to stitch the next bit. So as before, we're going to roll. This time I'm going to use a stick because it's just a little bit bigger, but it also gives me a little bit of purchase. This is a 2mm stick. So you can use an awl. Just make sure that it's a straight awl, not a tapered one. Otherwise your toggle will be tapered funny. I'm just going to roll it a little bit to really tighten it in, and roll and stretch. I do love this felt for this. And then I can do a few holding stitches. Again, really I would use a matching thread. It almost matches, but it's not quite there. And I can take that off. And that is a lovely, substantial toggle. I'm just going to fasten this off, and I'm going to show you a little loop fastening that you can do as well. So you could just stitch this end straight to your garment and make a shank as you stitch it on, or you can do a little loop shank. I love those buttons. Simple pleasures. You can work embroidery and so on around something like this because it's so substantial, the wool. You've got a lot to play around with that button just on its own. So let's do a really quick little loop shank for you. Cut a length of, I'm going to use pearl cotton. And let me find a suitable needle. I'm going to use it singly. I'm actually using a tapestry needle, which should go through the wool just fine, but obviously it will depend on the material that you're using. So I'm going to bring it up through the center of the wool. Now there's a lot of layers to go through, so this first bit just a little bit tougher, but just to sink that knot in. Now I'm going to work back and forth, and can you see I've created a little loop. You can use a stick underneath here just to act as a little gauge so that your stitch isn't really tight, or you can play this by eye. It's entirely up to you. I'm going to do this a couple of times. This can work on any of your handmade buttons as well, by the way. It's not just, you know, this sort of toggle design that you can do. And now I'm going to slide that out. And I am going to now cover this in a blanket stitch. And take it right to the edge, and then I'm going to go back and forth underneath a few times because I want that to stay nice and tight. And I'm catching some of the fabric as well while I do it to make sure that that sort of remains in place. And then I can take it all of the way through and pull quite tight, and then snip. So that should sink into the inside. And then what you have is a loop through which the button can then be sewn into place. A little toggle button. And again, square template to create a square. And I was going to use this fabric, but I think it's going to be blend into my table a little bit, so I will use the pink again for this. And I'm going to make a slightly larger square. Let's go to here. Okay, so there's my square. Now this one toggle is going to have a little bit of a dimple in it. So there's our fabric. Now what we need to do with this is that it's a little bit more complex in that you have to roll the sides in. In fact, before I do anything, I'm going to thread a needle so that I've got something ready to stitch this into place. And it's always a good idea to do this. So just a sewing needle and sewing thread ready. So I'm going to roll this in on itself. To the center section. Okay. I'm actually going to just pop a little pin in, just to hold it so it looks nice on screen for you. And then I'm going to roll this side in. Okay. So there is our, I don't know, unusual shape. And now take your stick and then roll in quite tightly. You can, if you prefer, not use a stick, but actually having a little bit of space in this particular button is a good idea. Now coming to this end, obviously we want this to be hidden, so we'll fold this end in. Just make sure that that's in so the raw edges are in as much as you can put them in. And there is a toggle. Okay. I'm just going, you can see that there's a little depression down the center. And this is exactly what we want, which is why we did the rolling first on either side. So I'm just holding that in with a little stitch. Now I'm going to remove this from the stick. Just fold that in a little bit more. And then bind really tightly inside that depression. Work a few stitches to hold this. And then I can trim that. And that's held in really tight to create the dimple. Now what you can do is you can obviously bind it some more, work some embroidery around the edges. That's nice to do, just to fill all that swirl in. And you can also, of course, as you roll, before you get to the next step, you could add stitches as well. And just as with the wool toggle, you can add a loop shank. Toggle shapes such as this, besides being decorated and used on their own, can be used as centers for knots, for instance. So if you simply take these and snip off the ends, you've got a nice firm filling for a knot button. You can also manipulate them a little bit more so that you're folding in edges differently and create more decorative toggles. And you can cover them with fabric and create something a little bit different that way. You can also use these as a basis for a fabric covered button by gathering up and then using that as a filling. So there's a lot of different possibilities with using a cloth toggle. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this little video, and do please click like and subscribe and that little bell icon to be notified when I next upload. It all helps the channel's algorithms. Take care, stay safe, bye-bye.